Have you ever wondered why nearly every country on Earth seems to follow the same blueprint? Defined borders, a national flag, passports, a centralized government, normally with a military and police force, and a seat at the United Nations? From Iceland to Indonesia, Botswana to Brazil, the world is divided into nearly 200 sovereign states. This apparent uniformity is surprisingly recent and deeply political. But where did this idea come from? Why is it so uniform across such a diverse planet? The answer lies not in geography or culture, but in history, and in particular, the story of how one political system, forged in Europe in the aftermath of centuries of war and rivalry, came to be exported across the globe. We've already explored how the modern state system emerged in Europe, shaped by the decline of feudalism, the centralization of authority, and formalized treaties like the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. And as we also saw, Europe was hardly the only place with sophisticated forms of governance. From African kingdoms to Asian empires to indigenous confederacies in the Americas, the world was rich in political diversity before European expansion. Yet, despite this diversity, it was the European model that went global, driven initially through the process of colonization. Beginning in the 16th century, European powers like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands expanded across the globe in search of wealth, land, and strategic control. And while we normally think of this process as being centered on soldiers, missionaries, and merchants, they also brought with them a political model of the centralized territorial state. In many cases, European empires dismantled or restructured local political systems to fit their own administrative needs. Colonial states weren't interested in building inclusive political communities. They wanted reliable mechanisms to extract labor, enforce order, and maximize imperial returns. And they used different strategies to govern. Under direct rule, practiced primarily by France, Britain, and Portugal, colonial authorities imposed their own bureaucracies, laws, and languages, often sidelining or eliminating traditional structures. Colonies were, in theory, if not always in practice, extensions of the metropole meant to be assimilated into a European image. By contrast, indirect rule, most famously used by the British, worked largely through existing local leaders. Chiefs or kings retained nominal authority, and local customs and traditions were often preserved, but only as long as they served colonial interests. These intermediaries were often redefined, appointed, or even invented by colonial officials. But while the two systems differ in their method, their effect was similar, reshaping political authority and embedding the logics of statehood, territory, hierarchy, and control into colonized societies. Both systems introduced institutions like fixed borders, census taking, legal codes, and tax collection, frequently enforced by violence or coercion. So whether it was the British using local princes in India to govern in their name, or the French imposing centralized bureaucracy in West Africa, the result was the same. Indigenous forms of authority were subordinated to European conceptions of sovereignty and control. And over time, even societies that retained a degree of autonomy, like Siam, Thailand, or Ethiopia, adopted aspects of the European state model to avoid colonization or to assert their modernity on the global stage. To be clear, this wasn't a passive process. Colonized peoples resisted, adapted, and negotiated. Yet the framework they resisted within, the territorial sovereign state, was increasingly the only game in town. Indeed, by the 20th century, this state-based model had become so dominant that even movements for independence fought not to dismantle it, but to gain recognition within it. Alongside direct and indirect rule, there was a third and in some ways more transformative form of colonialism, settler colonialism. Unlike other models that governed local populations from a distance or through intermediaries, settler colonies aimed to permanently displace indigenous societies and replace them with European populations and institutions. Indeed, Patrick Wolfe powerfully describes settler colonialism as a logic of elimination, aiming to erase the indigenous presence and replace it with a settler society rooted in European norms. For Wolfe, the very structure of settler colonial societies necessitates the erasure of indigenous peoples and their cultures in order to establish dominance over the land. This erasure is operationalized through various tactics, including violence and physical elimination, cultural assimilation and erasure, elimination of indigenous political and economic systems, and social erasure. In settler societies like the United States, Canada, Australia, and parts of southern Africa, European settlers brought not only their cultures and languages, but also their political systems. They built parliaments, courts, implemented land and farming systems, and imposed police forces modeled directly on those in Europe. The indigenous political systems they encountered were often violently removed or rendered invisible. As these settler colonies gained independence, they didn't reject the European state model, they embodied it. In many cases, they became some of its most enthusiastic promoters, helping solidify a global order based on European political norms and institutions. The mid-20th century marked a dramatic turning point. As European empires weakened after World War II, anti-colonial movements emerged, led by notable figures like Gandhi and Nehru in India, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and countless others. These movements pushed for independence and sovereignty. Between the 1940s and the 1980s, over 100 new states joined the international system, and almost all of them adopted the European model of the state: defined territory, centralized government, and recognition under international law. Most postcolonial societies inherited the borders, institutions, and administrative hierarchies established under colonial rule. Many of those borders were artificial, cutting across ethnic, linguistic, or religious communities and bearing little connection to the on-the-ground realities and histories of the newly independent states. But for the most part, these boundaries remained in place, as changing them was viewed as being too risky or too destabilizing. Newly independent leaders also generally embraced the state model not just as a tool of governance, but as a badge of modernity and international legitimacy. To be taken seriously on the world stage meant adopting the language of sovereignty, bureaucracy, and territorial integrity. In effect, decolonization didn't challenge the state system, it universalized it. By the 1970s, the state had become the default unit of international politics, whether it fit local realities or not. By the mid-20th century, the modern state system wasn't just a fact on the ground, it was becoming a formalized global norm. The founding of the United Nations in 1945 helped codify what it meant to be a state: a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Article 2 of the UN Charter enshrined the principle of sovereign equality of states, regardless of their size, power, or history. Every state was entitled to non-interference in its internal affairs and equal standing in the General Assembly. And over time, international law reinforced this model. Institutions like the International Court of Justice, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and numerous UN declarations helped standardize the rights and responsibilities of states. In 1960, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 1514, the Declaration on Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, affirming that colonialism violated fundamental human rights, and it did so by invoking the rights of all people to self-determination within the framework of statehood. Membership in the United Nations became the gold standard for legitimacy. By the late 20th century, to be recognized as a state was not just a political fact, it was a legal identity backed by international norms and institutions. Ironically, some of the most forceful defenders of sovereignty and non-interference weren't the long-established European powers, but the newly independent post-colonial states. Many of these states had inherited artificial borders drawn in European capitals with little regard for local realities. Their internal authority, which we often describe as de facto sovereignty, was often fragile, their institutions newly formed, and their territorial control uneven at best. In this context, de jure sovereignty, legal recognition at the international level, became critically important, especially when de facto control on the ground was contested. That helps to explain why post-colonial states in forums like the Organization of African Unity, which would later become the African Union, adopted a principle of inviolable borders in 1964, not because these borders were ideal, but to prevent a wave of successionist conflicts and protect their hard-won independence. But while international law helped institutionalize the state system and offered post-colonial governments a framework for asserting legal sovereignty, it did not erase the deep structural inequalities embedded in how that system had spread. In fact, the very features that made statehood so desirable, recognition, stability, protection, often masked underlying tensions and vulnerabilities. Indeed, by the end of the 20th century, the modern state had become the universal building block of global politics. but its spread through conquest, administration, and legal codification left behind a complicated and uneven legacy, particularly in postcolonial societies. Many of these states were born in the shadow of empire. Their borders were often drawn to serve European strategic or economic interests, not to reflect local identities or historical ties. As a result, deeply diverse societies were squeezed into rigid, centralized bureaucratic states. Indigenous or layered governance was replaced by new governments, which often struggled to establish legitimacy and control. This mismatch contributed to persistent instability, authoritarianism, and in some cases violent conflict. And even as the state system became global, power within it remained highly unequal. Former colonial powers retained privileged positions in international institutions like the UN Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Meanwhile, states in the global south often faced pressure to conform to Western standards of governance, democracy, and economic openness, standards shaped by histories and conditions very different from their own. Not surprisingly, then, postcolonial scholars have challenged this system's Eurocentric bias. As Amitav Acharya, one of the leading theorists of global IR, argues, the spread of the state system didn't mean the spread of equality, it meant the imposition of a particular Western model of order, one that too often dismissed or erased non-Western political traditions and alternatives. Similarly, scholars like Cheryl Harris remind us that sovereignty can function not only as a shield against interference, but also as a tool of exclusion, protecting state elites while silencing marginalized voices within. Importantly, the notion of state failure, frequently applied to postcolonial societies, often reflects these same biases. When states in the global south are labeled as failed or fragile, it's often because they don't conform to Western expectations about what a state should look like. But as Acharya and others have argued, this overlooks the fact that postcolonial states have often used sovereignty strategically, not as a sign of failure, but as a means of asserting autonomy, resisting neocolonial intervention, and protecting political space for self-determination. Today, the state system faces new pressures. Climate change, pandemics, transnational capitalism, cyber warfare, and digital surveillance all cross borders with ease. These global challenges raise a profound question. Can an international system built for territorial control and exclusive authority still function in an interconnected, interdependent world? The modern state system began as a European institution, but through colonization, decolonization, and global institutionalization, it became the template for political life across the planet. For many in the global south, statehood brought a path to autonomy and self-determination, but it also came with inherited borders, rigid institutions, and uneven power. And today, as we face borderless crises, climate change, pandemics, cyber warfare, global inequality, and so on, we're left to ask, can a system built around sovereignty and territory still meet the needs of a deeply interconnected world? That's a question we'll continue to grapple with throughout the course, and one that remains central to the challenges of global politics today. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and as always, thanks for watching.